All right, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, if we're picking up here in verse 17, and again, Paul is just continuing to explain. Really, right now, he's interested in kind of explaining his absence, I guess we might say, more than anything else. He's taking great pains to make sure that they understand who he is and that his actions among them were genuine and were done for their benefit. He does not want to be lumped in with a lot of the charlatans and these kind of false religious teachers that were very popular during that day and age, and still are, of course. But he doesn't want to be lumped in with them. We saw back in the first part of chapter 2, all of those contrasts made, all of the not this, but this. We didn't do this. Instead, we acted this way. He wants them to be very certain of who he is, what kind of man he is, what kind of conduct he had while he was among them. And he is doing that, as we've stated a couple of times, for a couple of reasons. Maybe foremost among them is to continue setting himself in their minds as an example worth following. They had done well when Paul was there for however long he was. It seems like it was probably a couple of months or maybe a few months that Paul had been in Thessalonica. And this church, these saints, this group of people had been just exemplary in their faith. Their response to Christ, their response to the gospel had really been extraordinary. And it seems the biggest reason underlying that success, or maybe I shouldn't say biggest, but a big reason, was that they had this good example there among them. They had Paul, who they could look to and they could follow. They could see someone who had been serving Christ for a while and knew how to do that, and they could see his actions. They could see what these principles looked like, living them every day, and they could try to grow up into that as a child tries to grow up into his father, or the whatever good example it is that he has in life. And Paul, now having had to leave when he didn't want to leave, and having had to stay away from them longer than he wanted to have to stay away from them, has grown concerned. I hope that isn't lost now. I hope that they aren't doing, falling back into the idolatry that they left behind or whatever it might have been, but he hopes that they will still find the value in his example, even though he's not there. Because, as we saw him saying in this section, in verse 17, 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 17, having been taken away from you for a short time in presence, not in heart. He's no longer with them physically, but they have still been in his heart, and he wants them to basically feel the same way, that he would still be counted near them in the ways that count, so that they could continue to have that example to learn from, to grow from, and so forth. So that's why he's been reminding them so much of who he was, what his character and conduct was like. He's just continuing to build this case of his care for them and his concern for them. He wants them to be very clear on that fact. And really that's almost all of what chapter 3 will deal with, is the love, the concern that Paul has for the church there in Thessalonica. But he's even doing that here in this last section of chapter 2. They're still in his heart, he says in verse 17. He wants to see them again, face to face, as we talked about last week. It's great to write a letter. It's great to get a phone call. It's great to have a Skype or FaceTime or whatever it is, but there's nothing that can replace, that can stand in for that one-on-one, face-to-face meeting. The encouragement you can get from that, the relationship that can be built in that way is paramount. And Paul wants that with them again. But they've been hindered in that. As we talked about last week, we don't know exactly what that would be. He mentioned Satan hindering us and coming again. We mentioned some possibilities that could be, I guess. Maybe some kind of political upheaval, maybe the political threat that existed. If he were to go back to Thessalonica, it would cause trouble for them. Paul rarely is concerned of that kind of thing on his own behalf, but maybe it would cause trouble for the church there. Maybe a physical ailment he's facing. Maybe he was sick. I don't know what was going on. Maybe the way that's phrased, it could have something to do with Paul is likely in Corinth while he's writing this, and had definitely spent time in Corinth by this point, it seems. Maybe the fact that Corinth was at times such a mess, maybe there was just some kind of scandal or some kind of difficulty there that he was having to attend to and felt, I need to stay here. I can't go to Thessalonica. You could explain that. I think you could describe that as saying, Satan hindered us. He caused this thing that I've now got to deal with, and I can't come see you, just as another possibility. Again, it's not certain. His point is simply, I want to be there. You want me there, but our adversary knows that it serves his interests best to keep us away from each other. That's how Paul is viewing it. And so this is explaining to them how he feels towards them. It's really mentioned there in verses 19 and 20. He would be able to say that they crown his work. They are really in many ways, the high point, the thing that he would, in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming, that they would be his crown of rejoicing, his hope or joy. Obviously, Paul isn't, let's not make it say more than it's saying. He's not saying, you guys and my work there is what's going to save me. That's what I'm counting on when Christ returns. He's simply saying, when my works are looked at, when that book is opened up kind of, and the Lord is looking at what I've done, and when we're called to account for what we've done, the thing that I would be able to look at and really consider my great achievement, the thing that I have done that is worthwhile, is you all, and the way you've responded, the way you have turned to God, the way you've entrusted him with your salvation. You are our glory and our joy. He is really letting them know how he feels. And again, this will continue in chapter 3. That's where we want to give our most attention to this morning. He is going to describe his sending Timothy there to see them and how that trip went for Timothy, his sending him to him, and then the news Timothy brings back. Before we move into chapter 3, anything else, lingering thoughts, questions, comments to make on chapter 2 before we wrap that up and move on? All right. I promise I'm not going to talk this much the entire time, but let's get into chapter 3. Read these first 5 verses together, and we'll continue to see Paul building this case for his overwhelming concern for the church in Thessalonica. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we're appointed to this. For, in fact, we told you before, when we were with you, that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might be in vain. So the picture Paul is painting is that he found himself in Athens, and Acts chapter 17 tells us about this. Paul left from Thessalonica, went to Berea, and then went to Athens before moving on further south into Corinth. But he says, while there in Athens, I sent Timothy to go and check in on you. Why is that a big deal? Why would we consider that something to be mentioned? What's the significance in Paul sending Timothy to check in on them there in Thessalonica? Okay. Okay. He's definitely addressing a need that they would have, and he even mentions that when talking about that he wants to come see them again. You know, for what purpose? To perfect what is lacking. I know that, I mean, he showers praise on them throughout. I know you all are doing well. I know that you're continuing on as you should, but there's always room for improvement. There's always some things that you can grasp a little bit better, and I want to do that. So he sent Timothy maybe to start addressing some of that need. They need the help. Yeah, Kenny. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's exactly right. Why is this a big deal that Paul sends Timothy? Because of who Timothy is. Because he matters to Paul. And if he's there, that's a huge improvement in Paul's life. That's a big lift to every day. That's a huge help to his work and to his state of mind and to his comfort and security. Timothy has already, they've not been together for very long, really, by the time this is happening, but already Timothy has become invaluable to Paul. And so I think exactly as Kenny is pointing out there, this isn't just Paul saying, well, Thessalonica is going to start whining if I don't go visit him. I don't want to go visit him. I want to do something else. I want to go to Corinth. So I'll send an underling out there and he can go look after him. And they'll think I care if I send somebody, a proxy. I'll go ahead and do that. I'll send somebody and that'll keep everybody quiet, but I won't have to put myself out. When Paul's sending Timothy, that's a sacrifice, was the best way to describe it. That's him sending the best man that he has. The way he describes him to that church in Philippi, I have no one like him who cares about you the way that I do. He sees Timothy as an extension of himself. They are so closely united in their goals and their desires in the kingdom. For Paul to part with that, this is a considerable deal. And so, even the way he describes him in verse 2, our brother and minister of God, our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ. One translation, depending on what version you're reading from, it's actually been kind of a debated or a disputed text that the oldest readings of that describe him as God's fellow worker, that he's God's co-worker. And it seems that kind of early scribes didn't like that. It maybe has been changed to reflect something different, that Paul's saying, no, he's my fellow worker, he's God's servant. But it seems the earliest text tradition there is saying he's God's fellow worker, which is putting Timothy in pretty rarefied air to say he's just working there alongside God. Everything that the Lord wants done, Timothy is his helper in doing that. Well, Paul's going to part with him to make sure that the church at Thessalonica has what they need to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. Steve, did I see? Yes. Yeah. No, that's a good analogy. Sometimes maybe you'd have that concern. Yeah, they looked good while I was there. They seemed zealous and everything seemed like it was taking off well. But doesn't that happen sometimes where things go well for a couple of months and then this person, never hear from them again? You never see them. I hope that hasn't happened. And that's kind of how he's described it there in verse 5. I didn't want the tempter to have tempted you. I didn't want my labor to have been in vain. I didn't want something to have happened that uprooted you. So you send someone back to kind of refresh that growth and make sure that it keeps going as it should. Of course. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, and we'll see in verse 6, the way this ends up is satisfying to Paul. It is positive, but yeah, he's going to send Timothy on this kind of fact-finding mission. He is to encourage and to establish, There's not really, there's not really mention of, we've kind of mentioned maybe Paul's fear or concern, and he mentions that in verse 5 of not wanting the tempter to have tempted them. And that is at issue, I guess. That is a concern that he has. But the primary thrust behind this seems to not be, worry or anxiety or anything, other than just wanting to take care of them, wanting to hear how they're doing, not fear that they're doing badly, and not thinking it'll all go badly surely if I don't get back there. It's just this overabundance of concern. I want to be there. I want to make sure that they're doing well. I want them to grow as I know that they can. It comes from a very positive motivation. It's not out of fear. It's out of love, is really the picture that we get as he is describing it. It's just this idea of we couldn't endure it. I couldn't endure to not know how you were doing for sure. And so I sent Timothy to check in. He will mention there the idea that, just kind of briefly getting back to something he had mentioned in chapter 2, verse 14. And there are a couple of allusions to it throughout the book of them suffering, some kind of affliction. We still don't know exactly what that is, what they would have been facing there in Thessalonica. But here he mentions the idea that this is a given for the first century church. This is a given, an expectation that you should have if you decide to be a Christian. You're going to face some trouble. You're going to be afflicted. There's going to be a tribulation, a persecution of some kind. You're going to face a challenge from the people around you. This should not have surprised them. It doesn't seem like it had. It doesn't seem like they were fazed by whatever it was they were facing, based on the report we get from Timothy. And Paul had evidently prepared them well for that. So we start getting this report in verse 6. Anything on the first 5 verses before we go on? Yeah, Ron, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, if Paul attributed his absence to the adversary, to Satan, he knew that he's going to be at work elsewhere. He's going to be trying to do whatever else he can. He's going to be trying to tear them down from the inside, whatever it is. So we need to make sure we're guarding against him. That's really the attitude that he's taking here. So he has sent Timothy. Now in verse 6, Timothy has come back. That's the occasion for this letter, really. Paul is sending someone back to make sure that they know that he knows now what's going on with him and that he's pleased. Timothy's come to us and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. For now we live, if you stand fast in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you? For all the joy with which we rejoice for your sake before our God, night and day praying exceedingly, that we may see your face and perfect what is lacking in your faith. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus Christ direct our way to you. And may the Lord make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all his saints. Now, Timothy returns to evangelize, is literally the word that is found there. In verse 6, he brought us good news. Evidently, that's the only place that phrase is used outside of talking about the gospel. But it is exactly what he's saying there. He evangelized when he came back. He proclaimed the good news. He brought us good news concerning you. Again, maybe a hint towards how Paul feels about these people, that when he got good news about them, he'd use that phrase to say, I mean, this was like hearing the gospel all over again almost, to understand that you guys were doing as well as you were. And of course learns that they don't have any hard feelings towards Paul. They don't think he abandoned them. They have good memories of him just as he does of them. It's all just this kind of one big happy family is the image that we're getting, and Paul is very, very pleased to have heard this. The idea there in verse 8, for now we live again, is really what he's saying there. We can breathe again. We have sort of been holding our breaths, just hoping that you are doing well, and having heard that report, we're getting a new lease on life. And then begins to offer this prayer for them. He mentions that they pray night and day for them in verse 10. That's the same way he had described his work when he's trying to describe his hard work that they had observed from him in Thessalonica, his work day and night, making tents. You'd seen me labor with my own hands so that you wouldn't have to support me, etc. And he attacks his prayer for them with that same zeal, with that same industriousness, is how fervently he prays on their behalf, night and day praying exceedingly. It's interesting that he is praying for something positive. He's not praying in a time of crisis. I heard things were getting bad in Thessalonica, and so then I began really praying to God on your behalf. This is proactive. This is positive. This is a good example for us of some of the concern, the regard that we should have for each other, that we are just kind of always involved in that prayer on one another's behalf, especially those that are closest to us, is just going to be natural, but he is praying for something that can happen, and he wants to happen soon, but it's something that is a positive, and from just a position of, I guess I don't need to be praying for this. It's not, like we said, it's not the crisis. It's not the worst news has come to me, and so I've got to just urgently run and fall to my knees and start praying that another bad thing won't happen. No, I want to be able to go and see you guys again. So within all of this, I wanted to just consider, I guess, by way of application, or, why are we spending time talking about this? Why would we have this letter kept for us to begin with? And what's the point of looking at all of these first 3 chapters? Because we don't live in Thessalonica, and we didn't know Paul personally, so why are we digging through their mail and seeing what was going on with them? I would ask ourselves, or I would ask myself, and invite you to do the same, if we match up with Paul's attitude and practice here in several key regards. One, I'm very impressed with his response to all of this, especially beginning in verse 9. What thanks can we render to God for you? Do we match Paul in that quickness to thanksgiving to God? When a prayer has been answered, something good has happened, when we get a good report on the well-being of someone we care about, whatever it is, are we that quick to offer that exceeding praise, that exceeding thanksgiving, that we have that first response, that first impulse to go to God with that kind of gratitude? Secondly, I would ask, do we match Paul in that concern for our brethren? That's what he's been building up all these first 3 chapters, is just exactly what he feels towards them, how much he cares. And to be frank, that's a difficult thing. That's a difficult thing for me, at least. Please don't mistake this for me telling all of you, I don't care that much about any of you. I mean, I could take or leave you. I don't see anybody here that I don't like. I see some people I don't know very well. I see some people I love a lot. But it's a difficult thing to move beyond yourself, to move beyond your immediate, wife and kids, husband and kids, parents, grandparents, some person you're having to take care of immediately, whatever it might be, to move beyond that and to consider, in the first place, just the congregation, the people you're with regularly, that you worship among, your church family, as we describe it sometimes. Much less to move beyond that to say, these people over here in the church that I worshiped with several months ago, that I knew for only several weeks, I have this degree of concern for them that I'm still, when I hear that they're doing well, it's like having breath back in my lungs. And it wasn't there when I didn't know how they were doing. The degree of concern, of thought equity that Paul spends for these people is really staggering. It's an example I feel myself needing to grow into. I'm nowhere near there. But this is really what God pictures for his people, a group that is united in that common concern and love for each other. And that seems to be something we lack in oftentimes. It's very easy to become insulated within ourselves, in our own families, whatever it might be, our own lives. Everyone's busy. Everyone has a lot of stuff going on. I understand. But if we had not heard from someone for a long time, maybe, would it be natural for us to start thinking, I wonder how they're doing? Man, I'd like to see them again and just know, how are things going with them? How are they doing? How are they faring? Are they still as zealous as they were when I knew them? Have they grown as much as it seemed like they were probably going to grow when they first became a Christian X number of years ago, whatever it is? Do we care that much? Thirdly, and I'll let you all talk here in just a moment. I'm just kind of asking these questions of myself. Do we share Paul's extreme focus on the spiritual? Notice, when he has been away from people for a while and he wants to see how they're doing and he wants to drop in on them and check and send Timothy to say, bring back news of how it is in Thessalonica. Timothy doesn't come back to say, yeah, they like their jobs and their kids are growing up to be happy and all this kind of stuff. And, so-and-so, just did pick other worldly thing. There's nothing wrong with that at all. We want our kids to grow up happy, and it's nice to hear that report from some other person, and we like it when we're succeeding in life and all those sorts of things. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But how much time do we spend relative to that on the things that Paul is concerned with? What are his questions, and what causes him to rejoice when he hears from Timothy, your faith, your love for us and for the rest of the brethren, your love for God, your holiness, your ability to suffer through tribulation and not lose your faith and not be tempted away from Christ. That's what he's concerned with. I'm sure he had a great deal of care for how are they doing physically or temporally or whatever adjective you use. But the main thing to him always boils down to that. What's going on with their souls? What's going on in their spiritual lives? And the most important part, are they growing there or are they not? That's where his focus always comes to. And I've mentioned before, that's just not something we ask after each other in very often. And to the point that it's kind of an uncomfortable thing. One of my friend's dads, when I was in college, we kind of laughed about it in college, I guess, just because it was always a funny question to hear. But he would, in talking to someone, he would say, how is your soul? How is your soul? And like I said, at 20, that was kind of a question we would make fun of sometimes, and we'd imitate it maybe to each other. How is your soul? But what a good question to ask a fellow Christian. If it's asked in sincerity, that's absolutely what we should be asking each other. How is your soul? Yeah, tell me how you're doing, and I'm glad you're over the allergies, and I want to know how your job is, and I want to know how old Timmy is now, and all those sorts of things. But brother, tell me, how is your soul? Are you growing in faith? Are you encouraging others? Are you holy and blameless before the sight of God? Are you ready for his coming? All those things that Paul devotes his attention to, do we match that interest in each other? And a fourth idea there is just, do we match his general attentiveness to prayer? We mentioned the thanksgiving, but this idea of him, laboring day and night in this, the same way that you would work hard at a job, is that something we're doing for ourselves, for our family here, for brethren that we know worldwide, for brethren that we don't know worldwide, who still need the help and the aid of God? Are we constantly going to war with them spiritually through the avenue of prayer? All right, I've seen several folks here. Gary, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Urgency would be an appropriate word to use, especially we've mentioned a couple of times. He ends every chapter in this book with some mention of looking forward to the coming of the Lord, and here he's given a lot of attention to the adversary and to kind of what's at risk, and what might happen if they were tempted away. So there is some of that same urgent concern on their behalf. He does not want to see something bad befall them. It seems just as clear from all of his characterization of it that he didn't think that was going to happen. He had high hopes for them, and just had such a high estimation of them that he's positive and kind of confident. But the danger is real, and so the urgency is real. That they grow, that they exceed and excel and build and do all those things he'll appeal to them to do, because of what is at stake. Renee. Yes. Yeah. No, this would be a key example of that. What does it mean to love one another as we are called upon to love one another? What does that look like in action? I feel like it ends up looking a lot like this. This kind of abundant concern, the sleepless night that might come up as a result of it, the desire to do whatever is necessary to meet the other person's needs, the wanting to provide whatever you can, putting them above yourself, sacrificing on their behalf. This is what that agape love would look like in practice. Kenny? Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Yeah, one idea in particular there, just the idea, Kenny mentioned the kind of the selfishness that this is at odds with so many times, that maturity that we have to develop that can look outside of ourselves. Paul, look at verse 7 here in chapter 3, verse 7, gives, maybe a little more insight into that as well. And maybe there's a cyclical relationship with some of this. He says, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. So here is Paul, who is, wherever he is, probably in Corinth, and whatever he's dealing with at the time, he's going through his own kind of conflict and affliction of his own, in his own place, in his own little world, in his own daily life that he's facing. He's got something challenging. But he says, that good report that we got concerning you comforted us and equipped us to navigate that more easily. You provided encouragement and comfort just by us hearing that you were doing well, that you were growing and thriving and all those sorts of things. So instead of someone who is only focused on self and doesn't care about anything else that's going on with anyone and thinks that's the better way to go through life, and when my problems start to mount up and my challenges are placed before me, that's the only thing that matters, and I don't have time to deal with anyone else or hear about anyone else's trouble because I've got my own stuff going on, and so I've got to deal with it. Part of what helps Paul deal with it when he has trouble is to open his heart up to these other people who are out here and gain encouragement when he hears they're succeeding. It's going well in Thessalonica. Well, then I can breathe a little bit easier here. He takes comfort from that. It helps him navigate the challenge that's placed before him. That, in turn, just makes this process even more easier because you think, well, man, I gained so much strength from these other people. I gained so much strength from other Christians. I know I'm going to need that. How do I get more of that? Well, you care about them more. You find more people that you're more attached to, and you develop those relationships and strengthen them so that those people will be there and will be an encouragement when you're going through your trials. And this ends up just kind of building on itself, I suppose. Good thoughts there. Anything else to mention? Comments, questions? Yeah, Stacy. Yeah. Yeah. Is a good way to, that question can be inobtrusive, I guess, if someone wants to give you something general, if they say, well, no, I'm doing pretty well, pray that things will continue. But that's going to help put our heart in the right place and help them know. We want each other to know that concern needs to be there to begin with, but we need to communicate it to each other as Paul is doing here as well. Yes. What can I do? And then I do it. And again, that's following through on this whole example that Paul is setting here too, as we've mentioned, is not just, well, I hope you're doing well, but I hope you're doing well, and I'm going to pray to God that will be the case. And he does it day and night. So putting those two examples together, I like that idea. Jack. Sorry? I guess the scriptures use different words for the same idea. Sometimes it is the heart, sometimes it is the mind. They all ultimately have a similar idea of being the the will more than anything else, I guess. Just the part of you that has desire, that has intelligence, that is made in the image of God to decide, to choose. Yes. Yeah. And that's going to be one of his closing appeals to them, I guess, is to give thanks in everything. That's the will of God. And to abstain from every form of evil, to not quench the Spirit, to do the will of God and surrender your will to his. All right. I've had the bell ring on me, so we're going to have to wrap up there for now. Next week, we'll get into chapter 4. Of course, we'll begin there. Maybe wrap up a little bit of what we talked about here in chapter 3, but start chapter 4. As I mentioned, just give this some thought during this week. If we are in line with this example that we're seeing here of a man who is constantly grateful, who is constantly praying on others' behalf as well as his own, but especially on others' behalf, and if we share that same regard for each other's spiritual welfare, if we find ourselves lagging or lacking, try to shore that up. See what we can do. And we'll talk as we develop this letter. We'll talk about what we can do to maybe increase that in ourselves. We'll get back to it next week. Thank you all so much. Always appreciate your time.